There are at least three concerns that facilitators should keep in mind that cut across all dialogues and contexts. The first is adapting your ideas to local culture and customs. And then balancing safety and risk, particularly with agreements. And finally, addressing power differentials in the group that you're working with. In Burundi in Africa, a group of local dialogue facilitators that had been trained by PCP was ready to go out and do the first round of conversations in villages throughout the country, bringing Hutu and Tutsi tribes people together. PCP was working with them on how to implement the learning that they'd received, how to bring dialogue out to their communities. And one of the things we were working with was how to handle communication agreements. It's our normal practice to draw information from participants in advance, to work with a planning team, and then to give a set of proposed communication agreements to people in the dialogue room. Well, we learned that in that culture, receiving a set of agreements, even if they're just proposed, would be experienced as an imposition, as undemocratic. So they modified that practice, keeping the spirit of agreements, but changing the way it was implemented on the ground, and had people create agreements in the room. They then went on to modify other aspects of the dialogue approach and create their own manual, their own approach that wove together traditional ideas and proverbs with what had been brought from the West from PCP. Although certain features that characterize successful dialogues will carry from context to context, agreements for instance, they'll vary in form depending on the context that they're found in. And agreements is a good example. Normally we have an agreement about speaking personally, speaking for yourself. But in some places, indigenous cultures for instance, the norm is to speak collectively out of one's collective identity. So that agreement needs to be modified. Some of the other things that should be attended to are questions that are acceptable, language, whether speaking is time-limited or free-form, and the role of the facilitator. All of these things will vary depending on where a dialogue is located and with whom. It's easy but dangerous to assume how much safety and how much risk a group is comfortable with. So using pre-meeting interviews and planning process, you can draw the information needed to create agreements that are going to be appropriate for a particular group. In many groups, for instance, the don't interrupt rule that's very common is not very useful because in that context, interrupting indicates interest and connection. Although a facilitator cannot hope to balance power outside of the dialogue room, there's much that can be done to increase the likelihood of equal voice inside the dialogue room. By collaborating with people in advance, by helping people prepare to be articulate, by using structures and agreements, and by facilitation, the facilitator works to ensure equality of voice in a democratic process. Now, ideas about power are easy to assume by the facilitator in a given situation, but that's a dangerous thing. We should work with participants to help them articulate what power means in their context and to decide together how they want to engage it in their dialogue meeting. For instance, in some situations, people feel very strongly that they want a hierarchical authoritarian or authority presence in their dialogue. And in some other situations, participants feel that they would rather exclude people from power positions from their conversation. So the facilitator has to work with people to define and then decide how to engage power dynamics in their particular situation.